The snow fell in thick curtains across the German countryside, muffling the world in an eerie silence that made every heartbeat sound like thunder. It was December 1944, and somewhere in the frozen forests near Hürtgen, a young American radio operator crouched in a foxhole barely wider than his shoulders, his fingers so numb he could barely feel the transmission key beneath them. Through the static and chaos of severed communication lines, he just received an impossible order: hold the position at all costs. Behind him, 3,000 American soldiers depended on one fragile radio link to coordinate an artillery barrage that could save them all, or obliterate them if the coordinates were wrong by even 50 meters. The Germans were closing in. He had maybe 2 minutes to make a decision that would either become the stuff of legend or condemn an entire battalion to annihilation. His breath formed white clouds in the December air. The forest was so quiet he could hear enemy boots crunching through ice somewhere in the darkness ahead. If this story already has you hooked, smash that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. What you're about to hear is the true story behind one of the most brutal, desperate, and heroic battles ever fought on European soil. A battle so intense, so cinematically perfect in its horror and courage, that decades later it would inspire one of the most iconic missions in video game history. This is the story of the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, where American forces faced not just a determined enemy, but nature itself turned hostile. Where every tree could hide a sniper, every shadow could conceal a mine, and where young men from farms and factories across America would prove that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. The Hürtgen Forest stretched across 50 square miles of dense ancient woodland along the German-Belgian border, a primordial tangle of fir trees so thick that even in daylight, soldiers said it felt like twilight. The trees grew so close together that tanks couldn't maneuver between them. Artillery shells hitting the canopy would explode in air bursts, showering wooden shrapnel down on anyone below with the force of fragmentation grenades. The Germans had spent months fortifying this forest, turning it into a maze of bunkers, minefields, and interconnected defensive positions that exploited every geographical advantage. They called it the Death Factory, and they weren't exaggerating. It was September 1944 when American forces first pushed into this green hell, and what military planners thought would be a quick operation to secure the Ruhr River dams turned into a 5-month nightmare that would claim over 33,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or driven mad by the relentless horror of forest combat. This wasn't the war of grand tank battles across open French countryside or the strategic island hopping of the Pacific. This was intimate, claustrophobic warfare, where you might never see the enemy who killed you, where men fought and died for patches of mud measured in yards rather than miles. The forest itself became a weapon. Trees splintered by artillery turned into thousands of wooden projectiles. The canopy was so dense that American air superiority meant nothing. Pilots couldn't see targets through the foliage, couldn't tell friend from foe in the perpetual gloom below. Radio communication was sporadic at best, cut off entirely at worst, meaning units became isolated, surrounded, sometimes wiped out before anyone even knew they were in trouble. Soldiers developed a condition they called tree burst psychosis, a form of combat fatigue where the constant threat of death from above drove men to the edge of sanity. And yet, into this hellscape walked ordinary Americans. Farm boys from Iowa, steel workers from Pittsburgh, college students from California, transformed through training and necessity into the most effective fighting force the world had ever seen. They carried the M1 Garand rifle, which General Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised, a semi-automatic weapon that gave American infantry a crucial fire superiority advantage over German bolt-action rifles. They wore the iconic steel pot helmet and carried enough equipment to survive in conditions that would have broken armies of previous generations. But more than their equipment, they carried something intangible. An American spirit that refused to accept defeat, that saw impossible odds not as a reason to surrender, but a challenge to overcome. The German forces defending Hürtgen weren't the broken, demoralized troops that Allied propaganda sometimes suggested. These were battle-hardened veterans who'd been fighting since Poland and France, who knew that every day they held the Americans back was another day for Germany to prepare defenses deeper in the homeland, another day to hope for some miracle weapon or political solution that might somehow turn the tide. They were fighting on their own soil now, defending their homeland with the desperation that comes from knowing defeat means total destruction. They'd prepared interlocking fields of fire, registered their artillery on every likely approach route, and seeded the forest with thousands of mines, including the infamous Bouncing Betty, which would spring up to waist height before detonating, designed to maximize casualties. The American strategy was straightforward on paper. Push through the forest, seize the high ground, capture the Ruhr River dams to prevent the Germans from flooding the approaches to the Rhine. Simple. Except nothing about Hürtgen was simple. The first units to enter the forest, the 9th Infantry Division, found themselves in a green labyrinth where maps were useless, where you could hear firing from every direction and couldn't tell if it was your own troops or the enemy, where men would step off trails to relieve themselves and trigger mines that left them bleeding out among the ferns while their buddies couldn't reach them without risking the same fate. Would you have volunteered to go first into that forest, knowing what waited inside? The fighting developed a terrible rhythm. Each day, American units would attack through the trees, gaining maybe a few hundred yards at tremendous cost. Each night, German counterattacks would push them back, sometimes beyond their starting positions. Entire companies would be reduced to squad strength in a single day's fighting. The 28th Infantry Division, which had proudly marched through Paris just months earlier, was virtually destroyed in Hürtgen, taking over 6,000 casualties in just 10 days of combat. Soldiers who survived described a landscape of absolute nightmare. Bodies hanging in trees from artillery blasts, wounded men lying in no man's land for days because recovery was impossible, the constant smell of death and cordite and wet earth. But here's where the true American character emerged, not in the grand gestures or heroic charges, but in the small, desperate acts of courage that happened 1,000 times a day in that forest. Medics who crawled through minefields to reach wounded soldiers, squad leaders who kept their men together through sheer force of will when every instinct screamed to scatter and run, radio operators who maintained communication under fire, providing the coordinates that could mean the difference between accurate supporting artillery and friendly fire disasters. One such operator was Private First Class Robert Hendricks, a 22-year-old from Ohio who'd been trained on the SCR-300 radio, the walkie-talkie that gave American forces a crucial communication advantage when it worked, and in Hürtgen's thick forests, often it didn't. Hendricks had joined his unit just 3 weeks before they entered the forest, a replacement for a radio man who'd been killed in the advance across France. He was quiet, competent, the kind of soldier who did his job without complaint and never drew attention to himself. His fellow soldiers knew him as Hank, knew he carried a picture of his girlfriend Sarah in his helmet liner, knew he wanted to be a civil engineer after the war. They didn't know he was about to become the linchpin of one of the most crucial small unit actions of the entire battle. It was December 13th, deep into the nightmare of Hürtgen, when Hendricks's company, what was left of it, maybe 80 men from an original strength of nearly 200, was tasked with seizing a fortified German position designated Hill 400. The hill itself was barely a hill by mountain standards, rising maybe 300 feet above the surrounding terrain. But in the flat, dense forest, it was the Everest of tactical positions. Whoever held Hill 400 could observe and direct fire across miles of American supply routes. The Germans had held it for months, had turned it into a fortress of concrete bunkers and machine gun nests, had cleared fields of fire through the trees that turned any approach into a shooting gallery. The attack was scheduled for dawn, with artillery support that was supposed to soften up the German positions before American infantry went in. Hendricks and his company spent the night in foxholes that quickly filled with freezing water, trying to catch fragments of sleep, while German artillery probed their positions with harassing fire designed to keep them exhausted and demoralized. At 0500 hours, American artillery opened up, a rolling barrage that was supposed to walk up the hill, destroying German positions while the infantry followed close behind, a tactic called leaning on the barrage that required precise timing and absolute trust in your own artillery. Hendricks moved forward with his company commander, Captain Miller, staying close enough to relay orders but trying not to be so close that one German bullet could take them both out. The artillery was thunderous, turning the pre-dawn darkness into a strobing hell of explosions and flying debris. The plan was working. The German positions were being systematically destroyed, and the infantry was making good progress up the hill, using the artillery impacts to mask their movement. Then, everything went wrong. At 0545, with the company halfway up Hill 400 and fully committed to the attack, the American artillery suddenly shifted. Instead of continuing to roll forward up the hill, the shells started falling short, landing directly on American infantry. Hendricks heard the scream of incoming rounds, felt the concussion of explosions that were far too close, saw men from his own company torn apart by artillery shells. It was every infantryman's nightmare, friendly fire, being killed not by the enemy, but by your own side's mistake. Captain Miller was shouting into Hendricks's radio, demanding the artillery cease fire immediately, but the radio was producing only static. Whether it was battle damage, atmospheric conditions, or just the chaos of combat, the communication link was dead. And with every passing second, more American shells were falling on American soldiers. The company was pinned down, couldn't advance because the Germans above were pouring machine gun fire down on them, couldn't retreat because their own artillery was blocking the route back down the hill. They were trapped in a shrinking pocket of safety that was literally being eroded by high explosives from both sides. This is the moment, the decision point that would inspire video game designers decades later, the impossible situation that required not just courage, but absolute clarity of thought under the worst possible circumstances. Hendricks looked at his useless radio, looked at his captain's desperate face, looked at the men around him dying from American shells, and he made a decision that broke every rule in the training manual. Could you have done what he did next? He abandoned the SCR 300, which was designed for stationary use with its heavy battery pack and limited range. Instead, he grabbed the backup radio, the smaller handheld unit that was meant only for short-range communication within the company. It had maybe a quarter-mile of effective range under ideal conditions, and these were far from ideal conditions. But Hendricks had read the after-action reports from other units, had heard stories about radio operators who managed to relay messages by bouncing signals off atmospheric conditions, by using elevation to extend range, by doing things that technically weren't supposed to work, but sometimes did when the need was desperate enough. He told Captain Miller he was going to climb higher, try to get above the interference, try to make contact with the Artillery Fire Direction Center that was controlling the barrage. Miller started to object. Moving higher meant moving directly into German defensive positions, meant abandoning the company at the moment when they needed their radio operator most. But Hendricks was already moving, sprinting up the hill through shell-torn underbrush, clutching the small radio to his chest like it was made of crystal. What happened next was witnessed by dozens of survivors, but feels almost impossible to believe. Hendricks ran directly through the German defensive line, not around it, not sneaking through some gap, but straight through it, running at full speed in the early morning gloom while German soldiers were still dazed and disoriented from the American artillery barrage that had just ended. He jumped over a trench, dodged between concrete bunkers, ran past German soldiers who were too surprised to react quickly enough. Later, German prisoners would describe seeing a crazy American running uphill like he was late for an appointment, seemingly oblivious to the battle raging around him. Hendricks made it to the military crest of Hill 400, the highest point that still offered some cover, and dove behind a shattered tree trunk. He was now essentially behind German lines, alone, with only his rifle and his radio. But he was also the highest point in miles, and height meant range. He extended the antenna of the radio, adjusted the frequency to the artillery fire direction net, and started transmitting blind, not knowing if anyone was listening, not knowing if his signal was even reaching beyond the next tree line. Fire direction control, this is Sierra 2 actual relay, urgent message, over. Static. Fire direction control, this is Sierra 2 actual relay, you are firing on friendly positions, cease fire immediately, over. More static. Hendricks could hear German voices now, close by, could hear them organizing a search for the American who'd somehow penetrated their defenses. He kept transmitting, varying his frequency slightly, trying to cut through whatever interference was blocking his signal. And then, like a miracle, a crackling voice came through the static. Station, calling fire direction, you are weak and garbled. Say again your message. Over. Hendricks had maybe 30 seconds before the Germans found him. He didn't waste time with proper radio protocol or careful explanation. He just said, with absolute clarity, cease fire on Hill 400 immediately. You are hitting friendlies. Adjust fire north 200 meters and resume barrage. Authenticate Delta 73. That authentication code, memorized by every radio operator, changed daily, was the only thing that proved Hendricks wasn't a German trying to disrupt American artillery. There was a pause that felt like an eternity, and then, authentication confirmed, ceasing fire, adjusting north 200, resuming in 30 seconds. The shells stopped falling on American positions. Hendricks had maybe 10 seconds to feel relief before German soldiers burst from a nearby bunker, having finally located the source of the radio transmission. He dropped the radio, grabbed his M1 Garand, and did what every American soldier was trained to do. He fought. The engagement lasted maybe 20 seconds. Hendricks got off 4 shots, knew he hit at least 2 Germans, and then something slammed into his left shoulder with the force of a baseball bat, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. He'd been shot, the bullet passing through his shoulder and exiting out his back. The pain was extraordinary, but so was the adrenaline. He could hear more Germans approaching, could hear the American artillery resuming, now landing where it was supposed to, 200 meters north, right on top of the German reserve positions. His radio message had been received, had been acted on, had saved his company. Now he just had to survive long enough to see if it mattered. Hendricks did something that still seems impossible. He picked up the radio with his good hand, tucked it against his chest, and started crawling back downhill toward American lines. He crawled through German positions, through the gaps in their defenses, moving during artillery impacts when the noise and confusion would mask his movement. It took him 40 minutes to cover maybe 200 yards, leaving a blood trail that was immediately obscured by falling snow that had started as he made his desperate journey. He was found by an American patrol at 0630, still conscious, still clutching the radio, still trying to transmit situation reports, even though he'd lost enough blood that he was barely coherent. Medics got him stabilized, got him evacuated, got him on a truck heading back to a field hospital where surgeons would spend 8 hours putting his shoulder back together. But here's the truly American part of this story. While Hendricks was being evacuated, the battle for Hill 400 continued, and now it was being won. With the artillery properly adjusted, the German defensive positions were systematically destroyed. Captain Miller led the company forward, and by 0800 hours, they'd seized the crest of Hill 400. They'd hold it against repeated German counterattacks for the next 3 days. A defensive action that would earn the unit a Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be awarded to a military unit. Have you ever wondered what makes someone run toward danger instead of away from it? The capture of Hill 400 was a turning point in the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, not because it ended the fighting, the battle would grind on for weeks more, but because it proved that American determination could overcome even the most prepared defenses, even the most hostile terrain, even friendly fire and chaos and every conceivable obstacle. News of the action spread through American units still fighting in the forest, became a story that was told and retold, became proof that courage and quick thinking could still matter in an industrial-scale war that often seemed to reduce individual soldiers to mere statistics. Robert Hendricks recovered from his wound, though he never regained full use of his left arm. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The citation described his actions in the clinical language of official military documents. But what it couldn't capture was the human element, the fear he must have felt, the doubt about whether his plan would work, the sheer physical courage required to run through enemy lines while wounded men from his own unit were dying behind him. After the war, Hendricks did become a civil engineer, just as he'd planned. He married Sarah, raised 3 children in a suburb of Cleveland, and rarely talked about his war service except to say he'd done his job like everyone else. He died in 1987, and his obituary mentioned his service, but not his decoration, not the specific action that had saved dozens of lives on a frozen hillside in Germany. But his story lived on, passed through military channels, studied at officer training schools, as an example of initiative and courage under fire. And in 2003, when video game developers at Infinity Ward were designing Call of Duty, they interviewed dozens of World War II veterans and researched hundreds of after-action reports, looking for moments that captured the essence of infantry combat. They found the story of Hill 400, found descriptions of the desperate fighting in Hürtgen Forest, found accounts of radio operators who maintained communication under impossible conditions. The result was a mission that shocked players with its intensity, with its refusal to sanitize or heroize war, with its insistence that courage often looks like terrified men doing their jobs despite overwhelming fear. The game's depiction of the assault on Hill 400, the artillery barrage, the chaos, the desperate fighting through fortified positions, was praised for its historical authenticity. Players experienced something that felt uncomfortably real, that forced them to confront the cost of every inch of ground gained, that made them understand why veterans rarely talked about their service in Hollywood heroic terms. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest finally ended in February 1945, after 5 months of fighting that had achieved all of its military objectives at a catastrophic cost. The forest was secured, the Ruhr dams were captured, the way was open for the final push into Germany. But the price had been extraordinary. 33,000 American casualties, plus uncounted German losses, all for 50 square miles of forest that was strategically important but would become tactically irrelevant once the Allies crossed the Rhine. Military historians still debate whether Hürtgen was necessary, whether the strategic objectives justified the human cost, whether there were alternative approaches that might have achieved the same goals with fewer casualties. But those debates miss something essential about what happened in that forest. Hürtgen wasn't just a battle, It was a test of national character, a crucible where American soldiers proved they could endure the worst possible conditions and still accomplish their mission, still maintain discipline and cohesion in the face of mechanized horror. Every soldier who fought in Hürtgen carried lessons from that experience for the rest of their lives. They learned that courage isn't a Hollywood concept. It's doing your job when every instinct screams to quit, when survival seems impossible, when the mission demands more than any reasonable person should be expected to give. They learned that technology and firepower matter, but they're not enough. That wars are ultimately won by individual soldiers making individual decisions in moments of crisis. They learned that freedom isn't free, that the comfortable American life they'd left behind was built on the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when their nation called. The forest itself bears scars from the battle even today. If you walk through Hürtgen now, you can still find shell fragments, still see trees that bear the marks of machine gun fire, still discover the remains of foxholes and bunkers slowly being reclaimed by nature. The German town of Hürtgen maintains a small museum documenting the battle, honoring both American and German soldiers who fought there, recognizing that courage exists on all sides, even when the causes are not equally just. But the real memorial to Hürtgen isn't in museums or monuments. It's in the freedom that battle helped secure, in the democratic institutions that American soldiers fought to preserve and extend, in the world order that was built on the foundation of Allied victory. Every American who's lived in peace and prosperity since 1945 owes an unpayable debt to men like Robert Hendricks, to the tens of thousands who fought in Hürtgen, to the generation that answered their nation's call and paid whatever price was necessary to defeat tyranny. When game designers chose to recreate the assault on Hill 400, they weren't just looking for exciting gameplay. They were trying to honor a specific kind of American heroism, the unglamorous courage of men who did their jobs under impossible conditions, who maintained their humanity and discipline when it would have been easier to break, who believed that their mission mattered even when the cost seemed unbearable. The mission resonated with millions of players not because it was fun. It was actually one of the more difficult and stressful gaming experiences many players had encountered, but because it felt true, because it captured something essential about what actual combat demands from those who wage it. The story of Hill 400 reminds us that history isn't made by grand strategies and abstract forces. It's made by individual people making individual choices in specific moments. Hendricks running through German lines with his radio. Captain Miller leading his men up that hill despite overwhelming fire. Medics treating wounded under artillery bombardment. Squad leaders holding their units together when dissolution seemed inevitable. Every one of those moments required a conscious choice to move forward instead of back, to act instead of freeze, to believe that individual effort could matter even in the middle of industrial-scale warfare. What would you have chosen in those frozen foxholes, with shells falling and friends dying and the mission seeming impossible? That question isn't just historical curiosity. It's relevant today, when Americans face different challenges, but challenges that still demand courage, still require ordinary people to do extraordinary things, still test whether citizens are willing to sacrifice personal comfort for collective good. The generation that fought in Hürtgen is almost gone now, the last veterans in their late 90s or already passed. But their example remains. They showed that Americans, when properly led and properly motivated, can accomplish seemingly impossible tasks, can endure unendurable conditions, can maintain moral clarity even in morally complex situations. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was brutal beyond description, destructive beyond justification, traumatic for everyone who experienced it. But it was also proof, if proof were needed, that American soldiers represent the finest qualities of the nation they serve. Not because they're superhuman, not because they're trained to be killing machines, but because they're ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, choose to do their duty, choose to trust each other, choose to believe that their sacrifice serves purposes larger than themselves. The video game that recreated his story reached millions of people who might never have heard about Hürtgen Forest otherwise, who might never have understood the reality of infantry combat in World War II, who might never have connected their comfortable modern lives to the sacrifices made by previous generations. In that sense, the game became a form of memorial more effective than any monument. It forced players to experience, however inadequately, something of what those soldiers endured. It made abstract historical events viscerally real. It created empathy across the decades separating comfortable present from desperate past. These stories matter because they remind us why courage matters, why freedom was never free, why the American experiment in democracy requires constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. The soldiers who fought in Hürtgen Forest didn't die for abstract principles. They died for each other, for their units, for the specific mission they'd been given. But the aggregate effect of all those individual sacrifices was the defeat of fascism, the preservation of democratic institutions, the creation of a world order where freedom could flourish. We owe it to those soldiers to remember them accurately, not as plaster saints or propaganda figures, but as real people who faced real fear and overcame it through training, leadership, and mutual trust. We owe it to them to maintain the institutions they fought to preserve, to extend the freedoms they defended, to ensure their sacrifices weren't wasted on subsequent generations who took democracy for granted. And we owe it to them to tell their stories. Stories like Robert Hendricks's desperate run up Hill 400, like the entire brutal campaign through Hürtgen Forest, like the thousands of small acts of courage that happened every day of World War II. These aren't just historical curiosities or entertainment material, they're the foundational narratives of American identity, the proof that when challenged, Americans can accomplish what needs accomplishing, can endure what needs enduring, can win what needs winning. The next time you see a World War II memorial, or play a historically based video game, or read about the Allied victory in Europe, remember that those grand narratives are built from millions of individual moments. Moments like Hendricks transmitting artillery corrections while wounded and alone behind enemy lines. Moments like soldiers climbing Hill 400 despite impossible odds. Moments like the entire American nation committing itself to defeating tyranny regardless of cost. Those moments still matter. Those sacrifices still echo. Those stories still inspire, teach, still remind us what Americans are capable of when necessity demands and leadership provides direction. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was hell on earth, but it was also proof of American character, American determination, American courage. And that's why these stories deserve to be remembered, retold, and honored. Not to glorify war, which needs no glorification, but to honor the warriors, who deserve all the honor we can give them. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering these untold tales of World War II, these stories of individual heroism and sacrifice that changed history, these reminders that freedom was never free and courage is never obsolete. These are the stories that shaped our world, told the way they deserve to be told, with respect, with accuracy, and with the understanding that every comfortable moment we enjoy was purchased with someone else's blood and sacrifice. Hit that subscribe button because heroes like Robert Hendricks deserve to be remembered, and stories like Hill 400 deserve to be told.